My name is Diane Whitfield. I'm 42 years old, and 3 months ago, I was the kind of woman who apologized for asking her own husband for grocery money. Today, I own half of a company he tried to hide from me. I have a lawyer on retainer, and I sleep better than I have in 11 years. This is the story of how one small, cruel act, locking me out of a credit card without a single word of warning, became the thread that unraveled a decade of lies. Stay until the end, because the final phone call in this story is the moment everything changed, and you will not see it coming. Let me start at the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before you understand who I became. I met Gerald Whitfield when I was 29, waiting tables at a steakhouse outside Manchester while I finished my accounting certification. He was 11 years older, confident, funny in that dry British way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room worth talking to. He drove a decent car, wore a decent watch, and told me on our third date that he wanted a wife who would run the home like a CEO runs a company. I thought that was romantic. I was young. I didn't understand yet that some men say things like that because they've already decided what role you'll play, and they're just waiting for you to agree to it. We married 2 years later. I gave up my job at the accounting firm, his idea, framed so gently I didn't notice it was an instruction, because he said a household needed one person fully present. I raised our 2 children, Oliver and May, now 15 and 12. I managed the house, the school runs, the doctor's appointments, the birthday parties, the in-laws' visits, the Christmas dinners that somehow always fell entirely on me to plan and cook while Gerald sat with his father and talked about his growing property business. And in exchange for 11 years of that labor, because it was labor, even though nobody ever called it that, I had one credit card in my name, attached to our joint account, with a modest limit Gerald reviewed every month like a headmaster checking a naughty student's homework. "What's this 34 pounds at Boots?" he'd ask, scrolling through the statement at the kitchen table while I served dinner. "Vitamins for the kids. And a birthday card for my sister." "You didn't mention that." "I'm mentioning it now." He'd make a small sound, not quite a laugh, and move on to the next line. That was our marriage. Not screaming, not slammed doors, just a low, constant hum of surveillance dressed up as care. I told myself for years that this was normal, that all husbands worried about money, that I was lucky he didn't drink or hit or disappear for weeks like my own father had. I measured my marriage against the worst men I'd ever known and called the result fine. Then came the Tuesday in March that changed everything. I was at the supermarket with a trolley full of the week's shopping, nothing extravagant, just the usual milk and bread and the sausages Oliver likes, and my card was declined. Then declined again. The girl at the till gave me that particular look cashiers give you, somewhere between pity and suspicion, and I stood there in front of 6 other shoppers, my face burning, fumbling to explain that there must be some mistake. There was no mistake. When I called the bank from the car park, sitting in my Vauxhall with groceries I couldn't pay for melting in the passenger seat, the representative told me, very politely, that the card had been suspended per instructions from the primary account holder that same morning. The primary account holder. Not joint account holder. Primary. I had never once, in 11 years, questioned why the account was structured that way. I had simply trusted him. I called Gerald. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear he was in a meeting, that clipped efficient tone he uses with clients. "Diane, I'm in the middle of something. My card was just declined at Tesco. In front of everyone. I'll explain tonight." "Explain now, Gerald." There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you the person on the other end is deciding how much of the truth you're allowed to have. "We need to tighten spending for a bit. I'll sort it when I'm home." He hung up. Not cruelly, that was almost worse. He hung up the way you hang up on a telemarketer, someone whose time doesn't matter enough to justify finishing the conversation. I sat in that car park for 20 minutes, and something in me that had been dormant for over a decade woke up and said, very quietly, something is wrong, and it is bigger than a credit card. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think a lot of women watching this will recognize it. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was humiliation, curdling slowly into clarity. I had spent 11 years making myself small and useful and agreeable, and the reward for that was a stranger at a checkout counter watching me fail to buy sausages. I left the groceries with the store. I genuinely couldn't afford them, not with the 20 pounds cash in my purse, and I drove straight to the bank. Not our bank branch, where the manager knew Gerald from the golf club. A different branch, across town, where nobody would recognize either of us. I want you to understand what I asked for when I sat down with the advisor, a soft-spoken woman named Priya who would end up being far more important to this story than I could have guessed. I didn't ask her to unlock my card. I asked her something simpler and far more dangerous. Asterisk, can you show me everything in my name and everything I have legal access to? Asterisk. That's when the first thread came loose. Priya pulled up our joint account, and beneath it, something I had never seen before, a secondary business account, opened 4 years earlier, with Gerald listed as sole director of a limited company called Whitfield Property Holdings. My name wasn't on it. That by itself wasn't shocking. Men run businesses. That's not a crime. What made my stomach drop was the address linked to the company's registered correspondence, not our house. A flat in Didsbury I had never heard of, in a building I had never visited, for a business I didn't know existed. Priya, to her credit, didn't say much. She's not allowed to speculate on private matters. But she did say one sentence that I've replayed 100 times since. Mrs. Whitfield, given the account structure, you may want to speak with a solicitor before you do anything else. I say that as someone who's seen this exact pattern before. This exact pattern. 2 hours after my card was declined at a supermarket till, a bank employee who had known me for exactly 90 minutes was telling me she recognized the shape of my own marriage better than I did. I didn't cry in that bank. I want to be clear about that, because for years crying was the only response I let myself have to things Gerald did. Instead, I asked Priya to print everything she legally could, I thanked her, and I drove to my sister Kate's house instead of my own. Kate is a family law paralegal, has been for 9 years, and she took one look at my face and put the kettle on without asking questions first. When I laid the papers on her kitchen table, the flat in Didsbury, the limited company, the sole directorship, the suspended card, she went quiet in a way I'd never seen her go quiet before. Diane, she said finally, how long has this business existed? For years. Do you know what a limited company director has to disclose in a divorce? We're not getting divorced. She looked at me for a long moment. You might be, and you don't know it yet. Or he's hiding assets for a reason that has nothing to do with divorce, and that's worse. That night I went home and did something I had never done in 11 years of marriage. I said nothing. I made dinner. I helped Oliver with his maths homework. I let Gerald come home late, as he often did now, smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize, and I watched him eat the meal I'd cooked and talk about his day as though nothing at all had happened. I have never worked harder at appearing calm than I did that evening, because I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that the moment he knew I was looking, he would have time to cover his tracks. For the first time in our marriage, I decided that his comfort was not my responsibility. My understanding was. Over the following 3 weeks, with Kate's guidance and a solicitor named Andrea Voss who specializes in matrimonial finance, I built a picture of my own life that I had been locked out of for years. Whitfield Property Holdings wasn't just one flat. It was 3 properties, purchased over 4 years using rental income from a 4th property, a small terraced house in Salford that Gerald had told me, back when we married, belonged to his late mother's estate and had been sold off years ago to help fund our own mortgage. It hadn't been sold. It had been quietly rented out for a decade, the income funneled into an account with my name nowhere on it, used to build a property portfolio worth, by Andrea's conservative estimate, somewhere north of £400,000. And the flat in Didsbury, the one linked to his company's registered address, wasn't an investment property at all. It was where he'd been staying 2 or 3 nights a week for over a year, according to a neighbor Kate managed to speak with under the guise of a completely unrelated errand. I won't dwell on the details of that part, because I think you can guess them, and, honestly, by the time I found out, it barely even registered as the worst thing on the list. That tells you something about how thoroughly a person can be betrayed. The affair was almost the least surprising part. The credit card lock, it turned out, hadn't been about tightening spending at all. Andrea explained it to me plainly. 3 weeks before my card was declined, Gerald had met with an independent financial advisor to discuss protecting assets in the event of relationship breakdown. He wasn't preparing to leave me broke by accident. He was preparing, deliberately, methodically, to leave me with as little leverage as possible, while he sat on a portfolio of properties I had unknowingly helped him build, because you should know, the mortgage on our family home, the one I'd been quietly making every payment on through the joint account for 11 years, had been used as collateral to secure financing on 2 of those investment properties. My name was on the debt. It was nowhere on the assets. I sat in Andrea's office when she laid this out, and I felt something shift in my chest, a cold, clean click, like a key finally turning in a lock that had been jammed for a decade. I wasn't devastated. I was done. Here is where I want to talk to the women watching this who feel, right now, in whatever version of my supermarket car park they're sitting in, that they are powerless. You are not as powerless as you think. The law, at least in the UK, and largely in the US too, does not care whose name is on the credit card. It cares about what was built during a marriage, who contributed to it, and whether one party concealed assets from the other. Every payment I'd ever made from that joint account, every hour I'd spent raising 2 children so Gerald could focus on the business, every dinner, every school run, every Christmas, Andrea told me all of it counted as contribution. 11 years of being made to feel small had, in the eyes of the law, made me entitled to half. I filed for divorce on a Thursday. I didn't tell Gerald. I let the solicitor's letter do that. He called me 19 times that day. I answered on the 20th, sitting in Kate's kitchen with a strength I did not know I had access to a month earlier. "Diane, what is this? What have you done?" "I went to the bank," I said. "You locked my card, so I went to the bank." And then I kept going. "You don't understand what you're throwing away." "I understand exactly what I built and exactly what you hid from me." Whitfield Property Holdings. The flat in Didsbury. Every one of your properties, Gerald. I understand all of it now. The silence on the other end of that call lasted longer than any silence in our entire marriage. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every ounce of the confidence I'd fallen for at 29. "I can explain the company. You don't have to explain it to me anymore. You can explain it to my solicitor." I hung up. Not cruelly. I hung up the way you hang up on a telemarketer, someone whose time doesn't matter enough to justify finishing the conversation. There is a particular, quiet satisfaction in giving someone back the exact silence they once gave you. I wish I could tell you the next 6 months were easy. They weren't. There were nights I cried into Kate's spare pillow, mourning not Gerald exactly, but the 11 years I'd spent believing a certain version of my life was the only one available to me. There were custody conversations that were painful and a mediation session where Gerald's new solicitor tried, unsuccessfully, to argue that the properties were premarital assets, a claim that fell apart within about 4 minutes once Andrea produced the rental income records I'd unknowingly helped generate every month for a decade. Oliver and May struggled too, the way children always do, caught in the middle of something they never asked for. I won't pretend that part of this story has a clean bow on it. Divorce doesn't. But I can tell you what happened at the end of the financial settlement, 6 months almost to the day after that declined card at Tesco. I walked out of that final mediation with the family home, transferred fully into my name, no mortgage attached because the settlement required Gerald to clear it using proceeds from the sale of 2 of the investment properties. I walked out with a lump sum equivalent to my share of Whitfield Property Holdings, which Andrea had fought to have properly valued as a marital asset built during our marriage, regardless of whose name was on the paperwork. I walked out, for the first time in 11 years, with a bank account that had never once had another human being's name attached to it, and a credit card that no one on this earth could lock but me. I used part of that settlement to do something I'd wanted to do since I was 29 years old, before Gerald convinced me a household needed one person fully present. I enrolled in the final module of the accounting certification I'd abandoned over a decade earlier. I finished it in 4 months. I now work 3 days a week at a firm 20 minutes from the house, a job I chose, for a life I am finally building on my own terms. Oliver and May live with me full-time, with Gerald seeing them every other weekend, and I'd be lying if I said that arrangement doesn't still ache some days. But they've watched their mother go from a woman who apologized for asking for grocery money to a woman who owns her own house outright and pays her own bills without asking permission from anyone. I think, whatever else this divorce cost us, that lesson was worth something to them too. I still think about that day in the supermarket car park sometimes, the melting groceries, the declined card, the burn of humiliation in front of strangers. For a long time I thought of it as the worst afternoon of my marriage. Now I understand it was the first afternoon of my actual life. Gerald thought locking a credit card was a small, invisible act of control, the kind of thing a woman like the one he thought I was would simply absorb and adjust to, the way I'd absorbed and adjusted to everything else for 11 years. He was wrong about a lot of things, but he was most wrong about that. 2 hours after that card was declined, I hadn't just walked into a bank. I had walked out of a version of my life I no longer had any intention of living. And if there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. The moment someone tries to make you smaller by cutting off what's yours, don't ask them for permission to look closer. Go to the bank. Ask every question you're entitled to ask. You might be standing closer to the truth of your own life than you think, and closer, too, to the version of yourself who finally decides she's done apologizing for it. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, you know exactly what to do, and if you've lived even a piece of this yourself, I'd love to hear it in the comments below.